The Bank of Korea has sounded an alarm it calls a semiconductor version of Dutch disease. I see this not as a story about Korea alone, but as a preview of the homework that Japan, a country now about to pour national money into semiconductors, will very likely be handed in the near future. Why would a central bank go out of its way to issue a warning about an industry that is doing spectacularly well? Today, we read between the lines of this seemingly puzzling piece of news. Hello everyone, I'm Ty, with 31 years in the semiconductor industry. In today's video, I'll walk you through what the semiconductor version of Dutch disease that the Bank of Korea warned about actually is, what happens to a country when its chip sector grows too strong, and how this whole story ends up rebounding onto Japan's own semiconductor policy, all in a way that ties together clearly. As always, let's first shrink the whole picture down into a familiar, everyday story. Picture a hot spring resort town. In this town, there is just one enormous inn that keeps enjoying an unprecedented boom. Its rooms are booked solid months in advance, and the nightly rates keep climbing higher and higher. If you look only at the town's headline sales figures, the entire resort town appears to be in fantastic shape. But when you peek inside the inn, the situation looks a little different. This inn runs on a small, elite crew, so despite all its success, it hardly hires anyone from the town. Most of what it buys in, the bedding, the ingredients, comes from suppliers outside the town. And with the money it has earned, it has even started building an annex over in the next prefecture. The inn is certainly raking in profits, but that money doesn't circulate much within the town itself. Meanwhile, changes start to ripple through the town. All the young people aim only for the high-paying giant inn, and the shopping street and the other, smaller inns can't secure enough workers, so they gradually wither. And the town's economy starts swinging between heaven and hell based on a single thing: the giant inn's booking status. When the inn is fully booked, the town feels bright. When the slow season comes, the whole town goes cold. The fate of the entire town ends up resting in the hands of just one establishment. The important point here is that weakening the inn is not the solution. What is really being asked is whether, while the inn is still booming, we can get it to shift its purchasing back into the town, help train and grow local people, and channel its profits into building the town's next pillar of business. From here, let me explain concretely how this simplified story is actually playing out on the real industrial stage. The main character is the Bank of Korea, the country's central bank. In an analysis reported by the Korea Times on July 19, 2026, the Bank of Korea warned that while demand for AI-related chips is lifting the Korean economy, capital and talent could become excessively concentrated in the semiconductor industry, weakening the competitiveness of other industries, a semiconductor version of Dutch disease that it says may emerge. Look at the numbers, and the background to this warning comes into sharp focus. The share of Korea's total manufacturing output accounted for by its IT manufacturing sector has risen from under 30% previously to 51% in the first quarter of 2026. And yet, IT manufacturing share of all employment in Korea stands at a mere 2.6%. It makes up half of production, but only about one worker in every 40. That is a very large gap. Why does it turn out this way? AI-oriented HBM, high bandwidth memory, generates high added value, but it is a capital-intensive industry that relies on enormous facilities, so direct employment doesn't grow anywhere near as much as the scale of the revenue. On top of that, Korea's semiconductor industry depends on imports for roughly 60% of its manufacturing equipment, and both Samsung Electronics and SK hynix are increasing their overseas investment. It's a structure in which part of the profit never circulates domestically and instead flows outward. Even so, the impact of the boom is intense. With expanding demand for AI memory, Korea's semiconductor prices in the first quarter of 2026 rose 92.5% year-on-year, and the IT sector accounted for 73.4% of the rise in export prices. That is precisely why the Bank of Korea proposes that the benefits should be spread beyond the chip makers themselves to domestic materials, components, and equipment makers. strengthening the links with the rest of the manufacturing sector. From here, let me dig in from a professional's perspective. First, the term Dutch disease. When people in the semiconductor world hear Dutch, many of them picture ASML, the maker of EUV lithography machines. But this story has nothing to do with ASML. The term comes from a natural gas field discovered in the Netherlands in the late 1950s, and it's an economics term for a phenomenon where capital and talent concentrate in an industry suddenly enriched by resource exports, causing the country's other export industries to weaken. Here's a fact that tends to get overlooked. Dutch natural gas did not account for the bulk of GDP. Even at its peak, the government's gas revenue was only around 10% of national fiscal revenue and just a few percent of GDP. And yet it still distorted the exchange rate, wages, public finances, and the industrial structure. In other words, Dutch disease is not a story about what fraction of GDP something is. It's a story about how, once a rapidly growing industry starts to move a country's capital, talent, and decision-making, the structure of the whole country can become distorted. Please don't misunderstand me. The fact that Korea's semiconductors are strong is, in itself, a clear strength for the country. Samsung and SK hynix are companies that represent the world's memory industry, and with expanding demand for AI servers, the value of HBM and DRAM is climbing even higher. What the Bank of Korea is wary of is not the strength itself, but the fact that, as a result of being too strong, the country's overall economy and market sentiment get whipped around by the single variable of memory market conditions. And Korea is not a country with nothing but semiconductors. Hyundai and Kia are formidable automotive groups in the global market, and LG Energy Solution remains among the world's top players in rechargeable batteries. There are pillars in shipbuilding, defense, and biotech as well. And the government is also moving to nurture strategic industries beyond semiconductors, such as future mobility, robotics, and nuclear power. This is by no means a country that is doing nothing. Even so, the market's assessment is heavily skewed. As of the end of May 2026, it was reported that Samsung Electronics and SK hynix alone exceeded 50% of the total market capitalization of Korea's stock market, the Kospi. In other words, the capital market sees a large part of the future profits of the Korean economy in AI memory and HBM. The market has already priced Korea as the semiconductor country. This, in my view, is the heart of today's story. 51% of production, yet 2.6% of employment. Two companies making up half of the stock market. Where this structure ultimately leads is not to a country where semiconductors are strong, but to a country where only the semiconductor companies are strong. No matter how spectacular the corporate earnings are, if the benefits don't spread to employment, consumption, and the surrounding industries, you can't say the country as a whole has grown stronger. What we should recall here is the lesson of resource-rich nations. Nauru, an island nation in the Pacific, once gained great wealth from exporting phosphate rock, but after digging it all out, it came face to face with the reality that no next industry had been cultivated. Unlike phosphate rock, however, semiconductors are not a resource that ends once you've mined it dry. They are an industry built by accumulating knowledge, equipment, and people. That is exactly why, in my view, the dividing line between winning and losing is whether you can convert that wealth, while you can still earn it, into the next industry, the next generation of talent, and the next technological foundation. This is not someone else's problem for Japan. Japan is, right at this very moment, in the middle of investing public money into Rapidus and into AI computing infrastructure. When we evaluate that investment, we need to look not only at the total investment amount or the scale of the plants, but at how much actually stays inside the country. Orders placed with domestic firms, the accumulation of technology, employment, and tax revenue. Japan's industrial structure, strong in manufacturing equipment and materials, is a tailwind, but it's not something we can simply sit back and rest on. Let me sum up. The Bank of Korea warned of the risk of a semiconductor version of Dutch disease, in which, behind the AI chip boom, an overconcentration of capital and talent weakens other industries. IT manufacturing accounts for 51% of production, but only 2.6% of employment. About 60% of manufacturing equipment is imported, and the major players' overseas investment is increasing too. So there is a structure that makes it hard for the benefits of the boom to spread domestically. The prescription is not to weaken semiconductors, but to spread their profits to domestic equipment, materials, and components, and to other industries. Will semiconductors make the country rich? Or will only the semiconductors themselves grow rich? This question, I believe, is aimed not only at Korea, but at Japan too, a country that has begun to bet its national future on semiconductors. While you still have a pillar that earns money, can you build the next pillar? Right now, in the very midst of the semiconductor boom, is exactly the time we should be thinking about this.
That's all for today. I'll keep bringing you semiconductor news and analysis. So if you found this useful, please like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. This has been Ty on Semiconductor News Decoded.